popular history makes the Irish potato famine sound almost gentle, a simple food shortage that caused some hardship. But here's the brutal reality nobody tells you. The Great Hunger killed a higher percentage of Ireland's population than any other famine in European history. Over 1 million people starved to death while surrounded by fertile fields producing abundant food that was exported under armed guard as skeletal children collapsed in the streets. This wasn't merely a natural disaster, it was a catastrophe where people with full bellies watched others die of starvation, where British officials spoke of surplus population while coffin makers couldn't keep up with demand, where relief ships bringing food passed export ships carrying away Irish grain. The story of the Irish famine isn't just about potatoes that turned black. It's about what happens when an entire people are deemed expendable. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right, let's head back to Ireland, 1845. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. But first, get comfortable. Seriously, adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket, because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. So, congratulations. You just woke up in a small stone cottage in County Mayo, Western Ireland. This isn't a thatched roof fantasy. It's a one-room mud-floored home where smoke from the peat fire hangs in the air because there's no chimney, just a hole in the roof. Not like your comfy bed right now? You're a poor tenant farmer, and the smell of peat smoke fills your lungs as you blink awake. The hard-packed dirt floor beneath your bare feet feels cool and slightly damp. Around you, the rest of the family is stirring. Perhaps 6 or 7 people in this single room, from grandparents to infants. You all slept on straw pallets laid directly on the dirt floor, covered with whatever blankets you could stitch together. Morning light filters through the single window, a small square opening with no glass, just a wooden shutter pushed open to let in the fresh air. The walls, built of stone and mud, glisten with condensation. The roof above is thatched with reeds from the nearby marsh, blackened from years of smoke from the peat fire that's kept burning day and night. Michael Fitzpatrick sits up and rubs his eyes. He's 43, though he looks 60. His wife Catherine is already up, stoking the embers of last night's fire in the small hearth built into the wall. Their 4 children, Bridget, Sean, Mary, and little Thomas, are stretching and yawning, ready for another day of work on their small plot of land. The morning routine never varies. Catherine kneels by the fire, preparing the morning meal. Boiled potatoes, as always. The Fitzpatricks, like most Irish tenant farmers, eat potatoes 3 times a day, not by choice, but by necessity. Wash your faces, children, Catherine says, her voice gentle but firm. Your father needs to be in the field by sunrise. The Fitzpatricks rent 3 acres of land from an English landlord they've never met, a man who lives in London and collects rent through his agent, Mr. Harrison. The land provides just enough potatoes to feed the family and pay the rent, with precious little left over. Outside, the air is crisp with early autumn. It's 1845, and the potato harvest season is approaching. Michael pauses in the doorway, looking out at the small field adjacent to their cottage. The potato plants stand tall and green, promising a good yield. If the harvest is bountiful, they might be able to afford a new cow, or perhaps even a bolt of cloth for Catherine to make new clothes for the children. It'll be a fine harvest this year, Michael says, more to himself than to anyone else, God willing. Little does he know that this harvest will be different from any other in living memory. The humble potato wasn't native to Ireland. It arrived in the late 16th century, brought back from the Americas by explorers. By the 1840s, it had become the staple food for most of Ireland's rural poor. Not just any potato, mind you, but a variety called the Irish lumper, a high-yielding, easy-to-grow potato that thrived in Ireland's wet climate and poor soil. A single acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a year. For the rural Irish, the potato was a miracle food, easy to cook, nutritious, and capable of sustaining life when little else was available. The average adult ate about 12 pounds of potatoes daily, children somewhat less. None of this was accidental. British landowners found it more profitable to use most Irish land for growing grain and raising livestock for export. The Irish peasants were pushed onto smaller and smaller plots of marginal land, where only potatoes could produce enough food to survive. As Michael works his field that morning, he has no way of knowing that across the Atlantic a microscopic water mold called Phytophthora infestans has made its way to Europe. It has already devastated potato crops in North America and is now poised to do the same in Ireland. The Fitzpatrick's village sits nestled in a valley between rolling hills, their small stone cottages clustered together like huddled sheep. From their doorway, they can see the grand manor house on the distant hill, home to the land agent. Beyond that lies the vast estate of their absentee landlord, land that most of the villagers have never set foot on. This morning, Michael walks to the edge of his potato field with his oldest son, Sean, who's just turned 12. They inspect the plants, checking for any signs of disease or pests. The plants look strong this year, Michael says, running his calloused fingers along a leaf. We'll start digging them up in a few weeks. Sean nods, serious beyond his years. He knows how much depends on this harvest. Will we have enough to pay the rent and still eat this winter, Da? Michael ruffles his son's hair. Aye, lad, and maybe a bit extra besides. But deep down, he worries. The rent has increased 3 times in the past decade, while the amount of land they're allowed to farm has shrunk. Across Ireland, nearly half the population depends entirely on the potato for sustenance. The British government considers Ireland a colonial breadbasket, extracting wealth in the form of crops and livestock, while the Irish who work the land subsist almost entirely on potatoes. As Michael and Sean return to the cottage for midday meal, they pass the village priest, Father O'Malley, walking briskly toward them. "Michael," the priest calls, his face grave. "Have you heard the news from Dublin?" Michael shakes his head. News travels slowly to their remote corner of County Mayo. There's talk of a disease affecting potato crops in the east, plants turning black and rotting in the fields. Father O'Malley's voice is low, but there's no disguising the worry in it. They're calling it a blight. Michael feels a cold dread settle in his stomach. Has it reached Mayo yet? Not that I've heard, but farmers in Wicklow and Wexford are reporting entire fields ruined. That evening, as the family gathers around their meagre fire, Michael shares the priest's warning. Catherine crosses herself. "God protect us," she whispers. "What would we do without the potatoes?" It's a question no one wants to answer. Without potatoes, there would be nothing. No food, no rent money, no seed for next year's crop, nothing. 2 weeks pass. The Fitzpatricks continue their daily routine, working from dawn until dusk, but now with an undercurrent of anxiety. Every morning, Michael checks his potato plants with extra care, looking for any sign of the blight that has reportedly been spreading westward across the country. Then one morning in late September, Michael notices something odd. A few of the potato plants at the eastern edge of his field have dark spots on their leaves. By afternoon, those same plants have withered, their leaves turning black as if scorched by fire. He digs beneath one of the affected plants, pulling up a potato. It looks normal on the outside, but when he cuts it open, the inside is dark and slimy. The stench makes him gag, a rotten, putrid smell unlike anything he's encountered before. "Catherine," he calls, his voice cracking. "Come quick!" She runs from the cottage, wiping her hands on her apron. One look at his face tells her something is terribly wrong. "The blight?" she asks, already knowing the answer. Michael nods, showing her the rotted potato. "It's here." Word spreads through the village like wildfire. By sunset, several families have discovered the same black spots on their plants. The parish priest organises a prayer vigil, and the villagers gather in the small stone church, their faces lit by flickering candles as they beg for divine intervention. "Let this cup pass from us, O Lord," Father O'Malley intones. "Spare our crops, spare our children from hunger." But prayers alone cannot stop the invisible spores carried on the wind. Within days, the blight has spread to every field in the village. The Fitzpatricks watch helplessly as their entire crop, their food for the coming year, their rent payment, their very survival, turns black and rots before their eyes. "What will we do?" Catherine asks one night after the children have finally fallen asleep. In the dim light of the dying fire, her face looks hollow with worry. Michael has no answer. For generations, his family has lived and died by the potato. There has never been a plan B. What the Fitzpatricks don't yet know is that they're living through the first chapter of a catastrophe that will eventually kill over 1 million Irish people and force another 2 million to flee their homeland. The Great Hunger, and Gorta Mór in Irish, has begun. By October, nearly half of Ireland's potato crop has been destroyed by the blight. Reports reach London of potential food shortages in Ireland, but the initial response is muted. After all, potato failures had happened before, in 1739, 1740 and 1801. Ireland had survived those, and conventional wisdom held that this blight would be no different. Sir Robert Peel, the British Prime Minister, does take some action. He secretly arranges for the purchase of $100,000 worth of corn from America to provide relief if needed, but he keeps this purchase quiet, not wanting to alarm markets or create dependency. In Mayo, the Fitzpatricks and their neighbours have begun to ration what few potatoes they've managed to salvage. Some are already mixing nettles and other wild plants with their dwindling potato stores to make them last longer. As Michael walks through the village on market day, he notices something disturbing. Carts loaded with grain heading toward the coast. Even as the spectre of hunger looms, Irish grain is being exported to England. "It's not right," mutters an old man standing beside Michael. "Our children will go hungry while ships full of our food sail to England." Michael nods in silent agreement. But what can they do? The grain belongs to the landlords, grown on their land by hired labourers. The British soldiers escorting the carts make it clear that any interference will be met with force. As winter approaches, the situation grows dire. The Fitzpatricks have exhausted their meagre savings buying meal and grain at increasingly inflated prices. Catherine has started watering down their food to make it stretch further. The children's faces grow thinner by the day. Sean, the oldest boy, offers to look for work in the nearest town, 10 miles away. "I'm strong, Da. I can help on the docks or in the warehouses. They might pay me enough for food." Michael shakes his head. "There are hundreds looking for work already, son, and they're turning them all away." He doesn't tell Sean about the rumours he's heard, that some landlords are already planning evictions for tenants who can't pay their rent. The winter of 1845-46 is harsh. Snow blankets the fields where the blighted potatoes still rot beneath the soil. Inside their cottage, the Fitzpatricks huddle around their fire, trying to conserve warmth and energy. Their meals grow smaller and less frequent. Catherine has always been resourceful. She knows which wild plants are edible, which can be boiled to make a thin gruel, but even these are scarce in winter. She begins to sell small items, a copper pot, a woolen shawl that belonged to her mother, to buy meal for her children. News reaches them of the government's relief programs. Public works have been established in some areas, allowing men to earn money building roads and bridges, but none have come to their remote part of Mayo yet. In January 1846, Father O'Malley brings word that a relief committee has been formed in the nearest large town. They're distributing Indian corn imported from America at reduced prices. "I'll go tomorrow," Michael decides. It's a long walk, especially in his weakened state, but there's no alternative. The next morning, he sets out before dawn, a few precious coins wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked into his pocket. The journey that would normally take a few hours stretches into most of the day. Michael's legs feel like lead, and he has to stop frequently to rest. When he finally reaches the distribution centre, he finds a scene of chaos. Hundreds of desperate people crowd around a small building, pushing and shoving to get to the front. British soldiers stand guard, their faces impassive. Michael joins the throng, waiting hours in the bitter cold. When he finally reaches the front, he hands over his coins and receives in return a small sack of cornmeal, yellow, gritty stuff that none of them have eaten before. "How do we cook it?" he asks the clerk. The man shrugs. "Not my problem. Next." The long walk home is even harder with the weight of the meal. Michael arrives after dark, exhausted but triumphant. Catherine meets him at the door, relief washing over her face. "Thank God you're back safe," she says, taking the sack from him. The children were worried. They gather around as Catherine tries to prepare the unfamiliar cornmeal. She mixes it with water, as she would with oatmeal, and cooks it over the fire. The result is a gluey, almost inedible paste that sticks to the roof of their mouths. But they eat it anyway, too hungry to complain. What they don't know is that this American corn, unlike the soft varieties the Irish were familiar with, needs to be properly ground and soaked before cooking. Without this knowledge, many Irish people suffer digestive problems from the improperly prepared corn, adding illness to their hunger. As winter gives way to spring, a glimmer of hope emerges. It's time to plant again. Surely the blight was a one-time catastrophe. Surely this year's crop will be healthy. Michael has carefully saved a few potatoes for seed, choosing the healthiest-looking ones from their diminished store. He plants them with a prayer on his lips, showing Sean how to space them properly in the freshly turned earth. "By harvest time, our table will be full again," he tells his son, trying to sound confident. Across Ireland, farmers are doing the same, planting whatever seed potatoes they've managed to save or buy, hoping against hope that this year will be different. For a while, it seems their prayers have been answered. The potato plants sprout and grow, their leaves green and vibrant. The Fitzpatricks begin to believe they might survive after all. But then, in July 1846, the weather turns. Week after week of rain and unusually cool temperatures create the perfect conditions for the blight, which had never fully disappeared. It had been lurking in the soil, in infected potatoes left in the ground, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And strike it does, worse than before. This time, it's not just half the crop that's affected, it's nearly all of it. Fields that had been green and promising one day are black and rotting the next. The stench of decay hangs over the countryside like a shroud. Michael stands in his ruined field, rain soaking through his worn jacket, and for the first time in his life, he weeps openly. This is no longer just a bad season. This is catastrophe. Catherine finds him there, his shoulders shaking. She puts her arm around him, her own face streaked with tears. "What will we do, Michael?" she asks, her voice barely audible above the patter of rain. He has no answer. The few potatoes they've managed to harvest are barely enough for a week. The rent is due in a month. Winter looms ahead, long and merciless. That night, as the children sleep fitfully, Michael and Catherine talk in hushed voices by the dying fire. "We could try to make it to Dublin," Catherine suggests. "They say there's more work there, more relief." Michael shakes his head. "How would we get there? We haven't the money for passage, and the children couldn't walk so far." He pauses, his voice dropping even lower. "There's America." Catherine's eyes widen. "America? But that's—" "I know, but they say there's work there, land even. Cousin Patrick wrote from Boston last year. He said a man willing to work can make a decent living." They fall silent, contemplating this drastic option. Emigration would mean leaving behind everything they know, their home, their village, the graves of their ancestors. It would mean a perilous ocean journey they might not survive, but staying might mean a slower, more certain death. As summer turns to autumn, the full extent of the disaster becomes clear. Not just in Mayo, but across Ireland, the potato crop has failed catastrophically for the second year in a row. Food prices soar beyond what most can afford. The workhouses, institutions built to house and employ the destitute, begin to fill with the desperate and hungry. In London, the political landscape shifts. Sir Robert Peel's government falls, replaced by Lord John Russell's Whigs. The new administration takes a different approach to the Irish crisis, influenced by the prevailing economic theory of laissez-faire, the belief that government intervention in markets is harmful. Russell and his Treasury Secretary, Charles Trevelyan, believe that the free market will eventually correct the food shortage. They discontinue many of Peel's relief measures, arguing that they create dependency and disrupt normal trade. For the Fitzpatricks and millions like them, this change in policy means one thing: they are increasingly on their own. As autumn progresses, Michael tries everything to feed his family. He takes odd jobs when he can find them, earning a few pennies for a day's hard labour. Catherine gathers shellfish from the shore and hunts for edible plants in the woods. The older children help, learning quickly which mushrooms are safe, which berries won't make them sick. But it's not enough. By November, they're down to one meagre meal a day. Little Thomas, not yet 5, cries from hunger pains. Mary's once bright eyes are dull with malnutrition. Sean and Bridget try to be strong, giving portions of their food to their younger siblings when they think their parents aren't looking. Michael knows they can't survive another winter like this. The choice that has been haunting him for months now seems inevitable. They must leave, either for Dublin or, if they can somehow raise the money, for America. But even as he comes to this decision, another threat looms. Mr. Harrison, the land agent, has been making his rounds, collecting rent. Many in the village can't pay, the Fitzpatricks among them. "You have until the end of the month," Harrison tells Michael, his voice cold. "After that, we'll have no choice but to evict." Eviction means more than just losing their home. It means being cast out with nowhere to go, no legal right to remain on the land that has sustained them, however poorly. It means joining the growing ranks of the homeless who wander the roads of Ireland, seeking shelter in ditches and ruins. As Michael walks back to his cottage after this confrontation, he passes the churchyard. New graves have been appearing with alarming frequency, mostly the very young and the very old, the first to succumb to hunger and disease. He pauses at a fresh mound of earth, marked only with a crude wooden cross. It's the grave of Widow Murphy's youngest child, a boy Thomas's age. The widow herself is nowhere to be seen. Rumour has it she's taken her remaining children and headed for Dublin. Michael kneels and says a brief prayer, crossing himself before continuing home. The sight of the small grave sharpens his resolve. His children will not be buried in unmarked graves. Somehow they will survive. That evening, as the family sits around their meagre fire, Michael shares his decision. "We're going to leave," he says simply, "as soon as we can gather what we need." Catherine nods, having come to the same conclusion. The children look scared but say nothing. They've seen enough to know that staying means starvation. "Where will we go, Da?" Sean finally asks. Michael exchanges a glance with Catherine. "We'll try for America," he says. "Your mother's brother is in Boston. He might help us get settled." "America," Bridget whispers, testing the word. At 14, she's old enough to understand the enormity of such a journey. "Yes," Michael says, trying to sound confident. "A new start, but first we need to find the money for passage. It's an enormous sum, at least $5 per person for the cheapest steerage accommodation. For a family of 6, it might as well be a fortune, but Michael has a plan." The next day, he walks to the manor house where Harrison lives. The land agent is surprised to see him. "I've come about the rent," Michael says. Harrison raises an eyebrow. "I've given you until the end of the month." "I know, but I have a proposal." Michael takes a deep breath. "I want to surrender our tenancy voluntarily. In exchange, I'm asking for passage to America for my family." This practice, landlords paying for tenants' emigration, has become increasingly common. It's often cheaper than the legal process of eviction, and it permanently removes problem tenants who can't pay. Harrison considers the offer. "I'll have to consult with the landlord," he says finally, "but it might be arranged, though it would be steerage to Canada, not America. That's the best I can do." Michael nods. Canada isn't Boston, but it's a start. From there, perhaps they could make their way south. "Thank you," he says, though the words taste bitter. Thanking the man who represents the system that has brought them to this desperate point seems wrong somehow. As Michael walks back to the village, he feels a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief that there might be a way out for his family. Grief for the home and land they'll be leaving behind. The graves of parents and grandparents they'll never visit again. The Ireland that has sustained and failed them in equal measure. What he doesn't yet know is that the journey ahead will test them in ways they cannot imagine, that the year to come, 1847, will become known as Black 47, the darkest chapter of the Great Hunger, that the ships carrying Irish emigrants across the Atlantic will earn a grim nickname, Coffin Ships. For now, though, there is a glimmer of hope, a chance, however slim, of survival. As Michael approaches his cottage, he straightens his shoulders. He must be strong for what lies ahead. He must believe that somewhere across the vast ocean there is a future for the Fitzpatricks. The potato blight that arrived so innocuously, just a few dark spots on green leaves, has already changed their lives forever, but its full terrible impact is still unfolding, not just for this one family, but for an entire nation. As the weak winter sun begins to set behind the western hills, casting long shadows across the blighted fields of Mayo, Michael reaches his cottage door. Inside, Catherine and the children wait, huddled together for warmth. Tomorrow they will begin preparations for a journey from which they may never return. But tonight they still have each other, and for now that has to be enough. The winter of 1846 arrived with a particular cruelty. Cold rain fell in sheets across Western Ireland, turning roads to mud and seeping through cottage walls. For the Fitzpatricks, waiting on Harrison's response about passage to Canada, each day stretched into the next, in a constant battle against hunger. Michael awoke to the sound of Thomas coughing. The boy had developed a persistent wheeze that tightened Michael's chest with worry. Food wasn't the only thing in short supply. Medicine, too, was beyond their means. "He needs more warmth," Catherine whispered, cradling the boy. "And proper food." Michael nodded, though they both knew neither was forthcoming. That morning, while Catherine stayed with Thomas, Michael took Sean and Bridget to search for anything edible along the shore. The tide was out, revealing a stretch of sand and rock where, if they were lucky, they might find shellfish or edible seaweed. "Stay together," Michael instructed as they picked their way across the slippery rocks, "and mind the tide." Sean, now 12, had grown serious beyond his years. "Da, look," he said, pointing to a cluster of mussels clinging to a rock. "There's a fair few here." They worked methodically, prying the shellfish from the rocks and dropping them into a small sack. It wasn't much, but it was protein, something their diet had lacked for months. As they worked, Michael noticed another family further down the shore, the O'Malleys from the next village over. They too were hunting for food, their thin frames bent against the wind. Michael raised a hand in greeting, but there was no joy in the gesture. This was survival, not socializing. "Times are hard all over," he murmured to himself. What Michael couldn't see from his vantage point was the stark contrast unfolding just a few miles away in the estate of Lord Ashworth, the absentee landlord who owned most of the land in this part of Mayo. The Ashworth estate's manor house stood grand and imposing on a hill overlooking the countryside. Its current occupant was not Lord Ashworth himself, who resided in London and visited perhaps once every few years, but his cousin, Edward Ashworth, who managed the estate in his absence. That same morning, as the Fitzpatricks searched for mussels, Edward Ashworth sat down to a breakfast of eggs, ham, toast and tea served by a household staff that included a cook, 2 maids and a butler. The dining room was warm, heated by a roaring fire that consumed more fuel in a day than the Fitzpatricks used in a week. "The post has arrived, sir," announced Jenkins, the butler, placing several letters on a silver tray beside Edward's plate. "Thank you, Jenkins." Edward sipped his tea and sorted through the correspondence. One letter bore Lord Ashworth's seal. He opened it first. Inside was a terse note from his cousin, responding to Edward's updates about the worsening situation in Mayo. "Edward, your reports about the potato failure are most distressing. However, I must insist that rent collection continue as scheduled. The London expenses do not diminish simply because of agricultural setbacks in Ireland. Harrison has my full confidence in these matters. As for your suggestion of reducing exports from the estate, I categorically refuse. The grain contracts with Liverpool merchants are far too valuable to break. The Irish situation, while unfortunate, is not our making. I expect quarterly profits to remain consistent. Regards, Ashworth." Edward frowned, setting the letter aside. Through the window he could see carts being loaded with grain from the estate's storehouse, grain bound for export to England, grain that could feed thousands of starving Irish. But his cousin's instructions were clear. The divide between the landed gentry and the starving peasantry was more than just economic. It was philosophical. Many British officials and landowners viewed the famine not as a humanitarian crisis, but as a natural correction to what they saw as Ireland's problems of overpopulation and economic backwardness. Charles Trevelyan, Assistant Secretary to the Treasury and the official most responsible for famine relief policy, wrote that the famine was an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population and a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence. Such attitudes shaped the relief efforts, or lack thereof, as the crisis deepened. Back in the Fitzpatrick cottage, Catherine was boiling the mussels her husband and children had collected. The small fire gave little heat, but it was enough to cook their meagre meal. "Will Dar get the money for America?" Mary asked, watching the pot with hungry eyes. "Canada," Catherine corrected gently. "And we hope so. Mr. Harrison has gone to speak with the landlord." In truth, Catherine had mixed feelings about leaving. Ireland was home, with all its sorrows and joys. The thought of crossing the vast ocean terrified her. Stories of ships lost at sea, of disease spreading through crowded passenger quarters haunted her dreams. But staying meant watching her children slowly starve. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Michael rose to answer it, his movement slow from weakness. Harrison stood outside, his coat buttoned against the cold, a walking stick in his gloved hand. "Fitzpatrick," he nodded curtly. "Mr. Harrison." Michael stood straighter, trying to maintain dignity despite his ragged clothes. "Have you news for us?" "I do." Harrison glanced past Michael at the family huddled around the small fire. "Lord Ashworth has considered your proposal. He's agreed to provide passage to Quebec for your family in exchange for immediate surrender of your tenancy." Relief flooded Michael's face. "When would we leave?" "A ship sails from Cork in 3 weeks. You'll need to be there by then. I've arranged for a cart to take you to the port." Harrison handed Michael a folded document. "This needs your mark. It confirms you voluntarily surrender all claims to the property." Michael hesitated only a moment before taking the paper. He couldn't read the words, but he understood what it meant. They were officially homeless, but they had a chance at survival. As Harrison watched, Michael made his mark at the bottom of the page, a simple X that ended generations of his family working this land. "The cart will come for you in 2 weeks, Harrison said, taking back the signed document. "Pack only what you can carry. The passage will be steerage class, so prepare for basic conditions." What Harrison didn't say, what he perhaps didn't fully comprehend himself, was just how basic those conditions would be. The ships transporting Irish emigrants were often cargo vessels hastily converted to carry human passengers. Conditions were cramped, sanitary facilities minimal or non-existent, and disease spread rapidly in the close quarters. But for now, the Fitzpatricks felt only relief. They had a way out, more than many of their neighbours could say. That night, as the children slept, Michael and Catherine talked in hushed voices by the dying embers of their fire. "Canada," Catherine whispered. "It's so far, Michael." He took her hand. "We'll make our way to Boston from there. Your brother will help us." "If we survive the journey," her voice caught. "I've heard stories. They say the ships are terrible, that people die before they ever see land again." Michael had heard the same stories, but he squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We're strong, Catherine. We'll keep the children close, keep them safe." They both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. As January turned to February, conditions throughout Ireland continued to deteriorate. The Fitzpatricks weren't the only ones seeking escape. Those who could afford passage, or who, like the Fitzpatricks, had landlords willing to pay for their emigration, began to leave in growing numbers. For those who remained, new government relief measures proved woefully inadequate. Public works programs offered employment, building roads and other infrastructure, but the wages were too low to buy enough food at inflated famine prices, and workers already weakened by hunger often lacked the strength for hard physical labor. Soup kitchens, established in some areas, provided thin gruel that barely qualified as food, and while some private charity efforts, particularly from Quakers and other religious groups, made valiant attempts to help, the scale of the crisis overwhelmed their resources. In market towns across Ireland, a bitter irony played out weekly. Food, grain, livestock, butter continued to be exported even as local people starved. British troops often escorted the export carts to prevent the desperate from seizing the food. One such market day, a week before the Fitzpatricks were due to leave for Cork, Michael walked to the nearest town to buy supplies for their journey. The 10-mile walk, once easy for him, now left him exhausted, his body weakened by months of insufficient food. In town, he found a scene of growing desperation. People with sunken eyes and skeletal frames huddled in doorways or wandered aimlessly, some too weak to beg. Outside a bakery, a woman clutched a crying infant, her hand outstretched for coins that rarely came. Michael purchased what little he could afford, some meal, salt, a small portion of dried fish for the journey. As he was leaving town, he passed a commotion near the harbour. A crowd had gathered, watching as carts loaded with grain approached the waiting ships. Among them, Michael recognised neighbours and villagers from miles around, all thin, all hungry, all watching Irish food bound for English tables. "It's not right," a man next to Michael muttered, echoing words Michael had heard countless times now. "Our children starve while the ships leave full." The crowd's mood was turning ugly. Someone threw a stone, then another. British soldiers moved in, rifles at the ready. "Stand back," ordered their commander. "Disperse immediately." Most of the crowd hesitated, intimidated by the weapons, but a group of younger men surged forward, attempting to reach the nearest cart. The soldiers responded instantly, striking with rifle butts and batons. Michael backed away, unwilling to risk injury when his family needed him whole. As he turned to leave, he heard a shot ring out, followed by screams. He didn't look back, quickening his pace despite his fatigue. Violence was becoming more common as desperation grew. Landlords and their agents were occasional targets, attacked on lonely roads by those they'd evicted. Food stores were broken into under cover of darkness. The social fabric was unraveling under the pressure of mass starvation. When Michael finally returned home, he didn't tell Catherine about the violence he'd witnessed. Instead, he focused on their preparations. In 1 week, they would leave the only home they'd ever known. That week passed in a blur of activity. They had little to pack, some clothes, a few family keepsakes, a small Bible that had belonged to Catherine's mother. Everything else they would leave behind or sell for whatever pittance they could get. The most painful decision was what to do with their cow, a bony creature now, but still their most valuable possession. In normal times, selling her would have brought enough money to live on for months. In these desperate times, with everyone selling livestock and few able to buy, her value had plummeted. "We'll slaughter her before we go," Michael decided. "At least we'll have meat for the journey." Sean and Bridget sobbed when they heard this plan. The cow had been part of their family as long as they could remember, but hunger left no room for sentiment. The night before the cow was to be slaughtered, she disappeared. In the morning, they found the crude rope that had tethered her severed cleanly, stolen, almost certainly by equally desperate neighbours. Michael couldn't even summon anger. Had positions been reversed, might he not have done the same? Their final night in the cottage was solemn. Neighbours came to say goodbye. Those who still had strength to walk, they brought small gifts, a hand-knitted scarf, a crude wooden toy for Thomas, a precious pinch of tea leaves wrapped in paper. Father O'Malley visited to give his blessing. "May God watch over you on your journey," he said, making the sign of the cross over each of their heads. "And may you find peace and plenty in the new world." After everyone had gone, the family sat in silence around their fire. Tomorrow, the agent's cart would come for them, taking them first to Cork, then onto a ship bound for a place they'd never seen, a place where they knew no one, where even the language might be strange to their ears. "Will we ever come back, Dar?" asked Mary, her small face serious in the firelight. Michael glanced at Catherine before answering. "I don't know, little one. Perhaps someday." But in his heart, he knew the truth. This was a one-way journey. Ireland, for all its suffering, was the only home they'd known. Tomorrow they would become exiles, joining the growing Irish diaspora, scattered across the world by hunger and desperation. Dawn broke grey and misty on their final day. The family was awake early, dressed in their best, which was still ragged and worn, but cleaner than their everyday clothes. Catherine had stayed up late washing and mending, wanting her family to begin their new life with dignity. As promised, Harrison's cart arrived mid-morning. The driver, a dour man who barely spoke, helped load their few belongings. The children climbed aboard silently, subdued by the solemnity of the occasion. Catherine was the last to leave the cottage. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her eyes taking in every detail: the hearth where she'd cooked countless meals, the corner where her children had been born, the walls that had sheltered them through summers and winters. A lifetime of memories contained in one small stone room. "Catherine," Michael called gently, "it's time." She nodded, wiping tears with the back of her hand, and joined her family on the cart. As they pulled away, neighbours lined the muddy lane, raising hands in farewell. No one spoke. What was there to say in the face of such parting? The cart rumbled down the lane, past the blighted potato fields now lying fallow, past the small churchyard where generations of their ancestors lay buried, past the familiar landmarks of their daily lives. With each turn of the wheels, home receded further behind them. The journey to Cork would take several days, travelling through a countryside increasingly ravaged by famine. What awaited them at the port and beyond on the vast Atlantic remained unknown, but for the Fitzpatricks, like thousands of Irish families that winter, moving forward was the only option left. Behind them, in villages and towns across Ireland, those who remained faced an even darker future. The winter of 1846 was just the beginning. The worst was yet to come, a year that would earn the name Black 47, when death from starvation and disease would reach its terrible peak, when workhouses would overflow with the destitute, when roadside deaths would become so common that bodies might lie unburied for days. For now, though, the Fitzpatricks had only the road ahead, the swaying cart beneath them, and the thin hope that somewhere across the ocean life might be better than the one they were leaving behind. As the cart crested a hill, giving them one last view of their village, nestled in the valley below, Michael whispered a prayer, not just for his own family, but for all of Ireland in its darkest hour. Then the cart descended the far side of the hill, and home disappeared from view. Cork Harbour bustled with a desperate energy as the Fitzpatricks arrived. Ships of all sizes crowded the docks, but the family's eyes were drawn to one vessel in particular, the Wanderer, a three-masted cargo ship converted to carry human cargo. This would be their home for the Atlantic crossing. The port itself was chaos. Hundreds of families like theirs waited in huddled groups, clutching meagre belongings. British officials moved among them, checking papers and directing people toward their assigned vessels. Private merchants hawked necessities for the journey at inflated prices, preying on the emigrants' fears. "Stay close," Michael warned his family as they navigated the crowded quay. Thomas clung to Catherine's skirts while Sean and Bridget pressed close to Michael. Mary, 9 years old now, held her mother's hand tightly. "Papers," demanded a port official, barely glancing at the Fitzpatricks. Michael presented the documents Harrison had given him, confirmation of their passage paid by Lord Ashworth. The official scanned them quickly. "Wanderer, steerage, over there." He pointed toward a group of similarly ragged families. As they joined the queue, Michael noticed a well-dressed man observing the crowds from a distance. Something about his thoughtful gaze, so different from the harried officials, caught Michael's attention. "Who's that?" he asked a man standing nearby. "Some writer for the English papers," the man replied with a shrug. "Come to see the wild Irish flee, I suppose." In fact, the observer was Nicholas Cummins, a magistrate and concerned citizen who had travelled through famine-stricken areas of Cork to witness conditions firsthand. What he saw would later fill a letter published in the Times of London, one of the few accounts that accurately conveyed the horror unfolding in Ireland. "I entered some of the hovels," Cummins would write, "and the scenes that presented themselves were such as no tongue or pen can convey. In the first, 6 famished and ghastly skeletons, to all appearances dead, were huddled in a corner, their sole covering what seemed a ragged horsecloth, their wretched legs hanging about naked above the knees. I approached with horror and found by a low moaning they were alive. They were in fever." But for now, Cummins simply watched, his notebook in hand, as the Fitzpatricks and hundreds like them prepared to leave their homeland. Not everyone at the port would be fortunate enough to board a ship. As the Fitzpatricks waited, a commotion erupted nearby. A family, parents and 5 young children, were being turned away from a vessel. "But we've paid," the father protested, waving papers. "Every penny we had." "These tickets are counterfeit," the ship's officer replied coldly. "You've been swindled." The mother collapsed to her knees, sobbing, while the father stood frozen in disbelief. Their children gathered around them, confused and frightened. Catherine exchanged a glance with Michael. They both knew what this meant for that family. No passage, no home to return to, and no money left. They would likely join the growing ranks of the homeless, wandering Ireland's roads in search of relief that rarely came. Such scenes were common in ports across Ireland. Scam artists sold fake tickets to desperate people. Some ships were dangerously overcrowded or unseaworthy. Others never arrived at their advertised destinations, and even legitimate passage offered no guarantees of survival. As the Fitzpatricks group was finally directed to board, Michael caught sight of their ship more clearly. The Wanderer was a converted cargo vessel, hastily outfitted to carry human passengers. Nothing about it inspired confidence. They joined the shuffling line of emigrants climbing the gangplank. At the top, another official checked their papers and directed them below decks to steerage, the cheapest passenger accommodation located in the hold of the ship. The stench hit them first, a suffocating mixture of unwashed bodies, sickness, and the ship's own odours of tar and bilge water. The steerage compartment was dim, lit only by a few lanterns swinging with the ship's motion. Wooden platforms had been constructed along the walls, creating crude bunks where passengers would sleep. "This is where we'll stay," Bridget whispered, her eyes wide. Michael nodded grimly. "For the crossing, we'll manage." they found an empty section of platform barely large enough for the 6 of them. Catherine immediately began organising their space, spreading their few blankets to claim the area. "It'll be warmer with us all together," she said, trying to sound practical rather than afraid. All around them, other families were doing the same, staking out tiny territories in the crowded hold. Some had brought food, hard bread, dried fish, perhaps a bit of salted meat. Others had nothing but the clothes on their backs. The Fitzpatricks were luckier than most. They had some provisions: oatmeal, dried fish, a small sack of ship's biscuits purchased at the port, and most importantly, they were still together, still healthy enough to travel. Many families had already lost members to hunger or disease. As night fell and the ship remained docked, the hold grew increasingly crowded. By morning, when the Wanderer finally prepared to sail, nearly 300 passengers were crammed into a space designed for cargo, not humans. On deck, the captain, a weathered Englishman named Barton, watched the final passengers board with a practiced eye. He'd made this run before and knew what to expect. Sickness would break out within days, and not everyone who boarded would survive to see Quebec. "Last call for Cork," shouted the first mate. "We sail with the tide." Below decks, the Fitzpatricks heard the shouts and felt the ship begin to move. A collective hush fell over the steerage passengers as the reality sank in. They were leaving Ireland, perhaps forever. Catherine made the sign of the cross. Michael put his arm around her shoulders. The children pressed closer, both excited and terrified by the ship's movement. "God be with those we leave behind," Michael murmured as the Wanderer slipped away from Irish shores. Those left behind would need divine intervention indeed. As the ships carried away those who could escape, conditions in Ireland continued to deteriorate. The winter of 1847 would become known as Black 47, the darkest period of the Great Hunger. In County Mayo, where the Fitzpatricks had lived, villages were becoming ghost towns. Some cottages stood empty, their inhabitants either dead or departed. Others had been deliberately destroyed. Landlords often demolished homes after evictions to prevent tenants from returning. The O'Donnell family had been neighbours of the Fitzpatricks. They had no wealthy landlord to pay their passage abroad. When they couldn't pay their rent, they were evicted in a scene that became all too common across Ireland. The process was brutal in its efficiency. A landlord's agent would arrive with constables and workmen armed with crowbars and sledgehammers. The family would be given minutes to gather what they could carry. Then the home would be destroyed, roof timbers broken, walls pushed in to ensure they couldn't return. The O'Donnells now lived in a crude shelter built from scavenged materials in a roadside ditch. Such ditch dwellers could be found throughout the countryside, former tenants with nowhere else to go. Mary O'Donnell, once a robust woman who had helped Catherine through the birth of little Thomas, was now gaunt, her eyes hollow with hunger and despair. Her husband Patrick had gone in search of work weeks ago and never returned. Her 3 surviving children, she had buried 2 already, clung to her skirts as she trudged miles each day to a soup kitchen established in the nearest town. The soup kitchens, set up by the British government in a belated acknowledgement that more direct intervention was needed, provided the barest sustenance, usually a thin gruel of cornmeal and water, sometimes with a few vegetables added. Each day, Mary and her children joined hundreds of others waiting in line, tin cups and bowls in hand. The portions were small, the soup watery, but it was often all that stood between them and starvation. On this particular day in February 1847, Mary noticed something unusual in the soup kitchen line, a well-dressed gentleman observing the proceedings, occasionally scribbling in a notebook. She had never seen him before. The man was Asenath Nicholson, an American traveller who had come to Ireland to document the famine. What she recorded would later shock readers in the United States. When I reached the spot, I saw 3 cabin walls still standing, but the roof and door were gone. I went to the entrance and there beheld a sight which will never be effaced from my memory, a sight which baffles description. On a bed of straw, exposed to the daylight, sat a poor man, wasted to a skeleton, with death plainly pictured on his face. Such eyewitness accounts from foreign observers provided some of the few accurate records of the famine's true horror. The British press often downplayed the crisis, while Irish newspapers lacked the resources to fully document its scope. For those unable to emigrate, options narrowed to grim alternatives: the soup kitchens, begging, or the most dreaded destination of all, the workhouse. Workhouses had existed in Ireland before the famine, built to house the destitute under the Irish Poor Law of 1838. But as starvation spread, they became overwhelmed. Designed to accommodate hundreds, they now held thousands, with new arrivals daily. The workhouse in Castlebar, the nearest large town to the Fitzpatrick's former home, had been built for 800 people. By February 1847, it housed over 2,000, with hundreds more camped outside its gates, hoping for admission. Inside, conditions were appalling. Families were separated, men to one wing, women to another, children to a third. Many never saw each other again. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded quarters. Typhus, dysentery, relapsing fever. The dead were buried in mass graves, often without coffins or ceremony, yet still they came, the starving, the homeless, the desperate, because the workhouse, for all its horrors, offered the slim chance of survival that the open road did not. Among those waiting outside the Castlebar workhouse gates was Patrick O'Donnell, who had not abandoned his family as Mary feared, but had been searching desperately for work or food. Finding neither, he had come to the one place he swore he'd never enter, hoping to at least secure a place for his children. "No more admissions today," shouted a workhouse official through the gate. "Come back tomorrow." The crowd groaned collectively. Many had been there since dawn, too weak to make the journey back to wherever they had come from, too desperate to give up. Patrick leaned against a stone wall, conserving what little strength he had left. Beside him, a woman cradled an infant who had stopped crying hours ago. Patrick feared the child was already dead, but couldn't bring himself to say so. Across Ireland, similar scenes played out daily. The workhouses, originally intended as a last resort for the destitute, became death traps as typhus and other diseases ran rampant. Yet the alternative, slow starvation on the roads, was often worse. Government policy continued to worsen the crisis. Under Charles Trevelyan's direction, the British response remained woefully inadequate. The prevailing economic philosophy of laissez-faire, non-interference in markets, prevented more direct food aid. The belief that Ireland's problems stemmed from moral failings rather than genuine crisis coloured official responses. In London, debates raged in Parliament about how much aid to provide and under what conditions. Some voices called for more generous assistance. Others argued that too much help would create dependency. Meanwhile, in Ireland, people died by the thousands. Bodies lay unburied along roadsides. Children with distended bellies and old faces begged for crusts. The dead were sometimes buried in mass graves, sometimes simply abandoned where they fell. In the midst of this apocalyptic landscape, small acts of humanity stood out in stark relief. Quaker relief workers distributed what food they could obtain. Some landlords, defying the economic orthodoxy of the time, reduced rents or provided for their tenants. Local communities tried to care for their most vulnerable members, but these efforts, however noble, were drops in an ocean of need. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed all conventional responses. For those who had managed to leave, like the Fitzpatricks, news from home was scarce and usually grim. Aboard the Wanderer, now a week into its Atlantic crossing, Michael thought often of those left behind, neighbours, friends, extended family members who couldn't escape. Life aboard ship had quickly settled into a grim routine. Each morning, passengers were allowed on deck in small groups for fresh air. The rest of the day was spent in the stifling hold, where privacy was non-existent and sanitation minimal. Sickness had broken out predictably. A hacking cough spread through the steerage compartment. Several elderly passengers had already died, their bodies committed to the sea in hurried ceremonies. Thomas had developed the cough, and Catherine watched him anxiously. They had heard stories of ships where typhus, ship fever, had killed half the passengers before reaching North America. "He needs fresh air," she told Michael, "more than just the morning ration." Michael nodded grimly. That evening he approached one of the sailors with their most valuable possession, Catherine's mother's silver cross, kept hidden until now. "My son is sick," he explained, holding out the cross. "He needs more time on deck. Please." The sailor glanced around to ensure no officers were watching, then pocketed the cross. "Bring him up at sunset," he muttered. "I'll be on watch. Half an hour, no more." That small kindness, purchased with their last heirloom, might make the difference between life and death for Thomas. Such were the calculations of survival that the famine forced on ordinary people. As the Wanderer sailed westward through February storms, Ireland continued its descent into what historians would later call the darkest period of the famine. The early months of 1847 saw death rates peak across the country, particularly in the west and south, where poverty had been most entrenched. The impact varied by region and social class. In Dublin and other larger cities, the middle and upper classes remained largely untouched, continuing their lives with little disruption while the poor starved in back alleys. In the western counties, Mayo, Galway, Clare, entire communities were decimated. Religious divisions added another layer to the suffering. The majority Catholic population was hit hardest, both because Catholics tended to be poorer to begin with, and because Protestant relief efforts sometimes came with pressure to convert, leading to accusations of superism, offering food in exchange for religious conversion. As spring approached, bringing the promise of warmer weather, Ireland faced a new crisis. The previous year's failed harvest meant few had seed potatoes to plant for the coming season. Fields lay fallow across the country, ensuring that even if the blight abated, food shortages would continue. In government offices in Dublin and London, officials tallied death tolls and relief expenditures with clinical detachment. The human catastrophe was reduced to columns of figures, the dead to statistics. Yet each number represented a person, someone like Mary O'Donnell still waiting outside the Castlebar workhouse as February turned to March, her children growing weaker by the day, or Patrick O'Donnell, who had finally gained admission to the workhouse only to find himself separated from his family and put to work breaking stones despite his own failing health. Or, like the Fitzpatricks, tossing on the Atlantic waves, facing an uncertain future but clinging to the hope that somewhere ahead lay a better life than the one they'd left behind. As Black 47 unfolded, Ireland changed in ways that would never be reversed. The population declined through death and emigration. The Irish language, primarily spoken in the hardest-hit western regions, lost speakers by the thousands. Cultural traditions were disrupted or lost entirely as communities disintegrated. And perhaps most significantly, the relationship between Ireland and Great Britain was permanently altered. The perception that Britain had allowed Irish citizens to starve while continuing to export Irish food fueled nationalist sentiment for generations to come. For ordinary people caught in this historical cataclysm, however, politics mattered less than daily survival. Each dawn brought the same question: how to find food for the day ahead. Each dusk the same prayer: to live until morning. Aboard the Wanderer, now 3 weeks into its voyage, the Fitzpatricks shared this focus on immediate survival. Thomas's cough had improved with the extra time on deck, but other dangers loomed. Food was running short for many passengers who hadn't been able to bring sufficient provisions. Water was strictly rationed and often foul. At night, as the ship creaked and groaned around them, Catherine would gather her children close and tell them stories of the new land they were sailing toward, a place where food was plentiful, where they might someday have a home of their own again. Whether she believed these stories herself, she never said. Michael had made connections with other passengers, a carpenter from Galway, a blacksmith from Kerry, men with skills that might help them find work in the new world. Together they planned and dreamed, their conversations a lifeline of hope in the dismal hold. And so they sailed on, carried by wind and current toward a distant shore, their fate as uncertain as that of the homeland they'd left behind. Behind them, Ireland endured its darkest hour. Ahead lay the unknown challenges of exile and new beginnings. The mid-Atlantic in March was no place for a ship like the Wanderer. Powerful storms lashed the vessel, sending it pitching and rolling through mountainous waves. In the steerage compartment, passengers clung to whatever they could grasp as water leaked through the deck above, forming puddles on the already damp floor. "Will we sink, Dar?" Thomas whispered, his small body pressed against Michael's side during one particularly violent storm. "Oh, no, lad," Michael assured him, though he wasn't certain himself. "This ship has weathered many such storms." In truth, the Wanderer groaned alarmingly with each massive wave. Above decks, Captain Barton and his crew worked frantically to keep the vessel on course, while in the hold below, hundreds of Irish emigrants prayed, vomited, and waited for the nightmare to end. Seasickness had struck almost everyone. The stench in the confined space was overwhelming, a mixture of vomit, unwashed bodies, and the waste buckets that were rarely emptied promptly. Many passengers, too weak or ill to reach the buckets, simply soiled themselves where they lay. Catherine had torn their last clean linen into strips, using them as makeshift masks dampened with their precious drinking water to help filter the worst of the smell. It was a small comfort, but in such conditions, small comforts became treasures. "Tell us about America again," Bridget requested during a rare quiet moment when the storm had temporarily abated. Like her siblings, she needed distraction from their miserable surroundings. Catherine summoned a smile. "Well, your Uncle Patrick writes that there are trees taller than church steeples and fields stretching farther than the eye can see. In Boston, there are buildings made of bright red brick and streets wide enough for 3 carts to pass side by side." The children listened, wide-eyed, as she painted pictures with words, images of abundance and space so different from the cramped ship and the blighted fields of home. "Will there be potatoes?" asked Mary, who barely remembered a time before hunger. "All kinds of food," Catherine promised. "Bread and meat and vegetables we've never even heard of." Michael listened silently, not wanting to dampen their hopes, but knowing the reality would likely be different. Irish immigrants faced prejudice and hardship in America too, relegated to the poorest neighborhoods, the most dangerous jobs, often unwelcome in their new home. But compared to what they'd left behind, even the slums of Boston offered more hope than starvation in Ireland. Not everyone aboard would live to see those shores. Each day, the death toll mounted. The elderly were the first to succumb, their bodies already weakened by months or years of inadequate nutrition. Young children followed, particularly those who had been sickly before boarding. The ship's routine included morning burial services, bodies sewn into canvas sacks, weighted with coal or ballast and slipped over the side into the churning Atlantic. Some families kept their dead hidden as long as possible, unwilling to part with loved ones in such an unceremonious manner. In a corner of the hold, a young woman named Eileen Kelly had been in labour for nearly 20 hours. Her husband hovered anxiously while two older women attended her, using their experience as mothers to guide the difficult birth. Catherine joined them, offering what help she could. Childbirth was dangerous enough on land with proper midwives. Aboard ship, with poor hygiene and no medical care, it was often fatal for mother, child, or both. "Push, girl," urged one of the women, a grey-haired grandmother from Donegal. "I can see the head now." Eileen sobbed with exhaustion, but summoned her remaining strength. With a final desperate effort, she delivered her child, a tiny, red-faced boy who entered the world with a lusty cry despite the circumstances. "A son," Catherine announced, cleaning the infant with water from her family's precious ration. "Strong lungs on him, too." It was a rare moment of joy in the grim hold, new life emerging even as death hovered all around them. The other passengers offered congratulations and what gifts they could spare: a scrap of clean cloth, a sip of smuggled whiskey for the exhausted mother, murmured prayers for the child's future. "What will you name him?" Catherine asked as she handed the swaddled infant back to Eileen. The new mother exchanged glances with her husband. "Michael," she said with a tired smile, "after your good man who helped us aboard." Michael Fitzpatrick ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased by the honour. Early in the voyage, he had given up part of his family's space on the crowded platforms to the heavily pregnant Eileen, allowing her to lie down more comfortably. Such small acts of kindness were the thread that held the community of emigrants together through the horror of the crossing. They shared food when someone's supplies ran out, took turns caring for the sick, combined their meagre resources to improve everyone's chances of survival. Not all ships fostered such cooperation. On some vessels, particularly those where passengers were even more densely packed, fights broke out over space or provisions. Theft became common as desperation mounted. Stronger passengers sometimes exploited weaker ones, creating a microcosm of the same inequalities they had fled. The Wanderer, while far from a pleasant environment, at least maintained some basic order. Captain Barton, though not particularly sympathetic to his human cargo, ran a disciplined ship. The crew, while avoiding unnecessary contact with the emigrants, performed their duties efficiently. 5 weeks into the crossing, land was finally sighted, the coast of Newfoundland. A ragged cheer went up from those passengers strong enough to climb to the deck and witness the moment. Though still far from their final destination of Quebec, the sight of any land was cause for celebration. "We've made it this far," Michael told his family that night. "The worst is behind us now." He couldn't have known how wrong he was. 2 days later, as the Wanderer made its way along the Canadian coast, a sailor noticed something peculiar about a passenger who had come up for his allotted time on deck. Angry red spots covered the man's face and hands. By nightfall, the diagnosis was confirmed. Typhus had broken out aboard the ship. "Ship fever," the passengers whispered fearfully. They had all heard stories of entire ships decimated by the disease, of arriving in port with half their human cargo already dead. Captain Barton ordered immediate quarantine for the infected passenger and anyone who had been in close contact with him. But in the crowded conditions of steerage, such measures were largely symbolic. The disease had almost certainly been spreading undetected for days. Typhus, carried by lice, thrived in the unsanitary conditions aboard emigrant ships. Its symptoms included high fever, a distinctive rash, delirium, and often death. There was no effective treatment available. Within days, dozens of passengers showed symptoms. The dead were now buried at sea daily, sometimes hourly. The ship's small quarantine area overflowed, forcing the crew to create a makeshift hospital in a cordoned-off section of the hold. The Fitzpatricks, through luck or providence, remained free of the telltale rash, but they watched in horror as families around them were devastated, parents losing children, children orphaned in the middle of the Atlantic. The dead slipped over the side with increasing haste and decreasing ceremony. "Keep to ourselves as much as possible," Michael instructed his family. "Touch no one if you can help it." Catherine boiled their drinking water when permitted to use the galley stove, a precaution few others thought to take. She inspected her children daily for lice, the disease's vector, picking through their hair meticulously despite the limited light. As the Wanderer approached the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Captain Barton faced a difficult decision. The outbreak aboard meant his ship would be subject to strict quarantine procedures at Grosse Ile, the quarantine station near Quebec. This would mean significant delays and potential loss of cargo contracts for his return journey. Some captains in similar situations had been known to conceal the extent of disease aboard their vessels, bribing inspectors or simply lying about the number of sick and dead. Others dumped bodies at sea just before arrival to reduce the reported death toll. To his credit, Captain Barton did neither. As the Wanderer finally approached Grosse Ile in early May, he ordered the yellow quarantine flag raised, signalling to authorities that infectious disease was present aboard. The quarantine station at Grosse Ile had been established in 1832 to prevent cholera from entering Canada. By 1847, it was overwhelmed by the flood of disease-ridden ships arriving from Ireland. Facilities designed for a few hundred patients now attempted to accommodate thousands. From the deck of the Wanderer, the Fitzpatricks could see the island, a green smudge on the horizon that gradually resolved into rolling hills dotted with white buildings. Along the shore, dozens of ships already lay at anchor, their yellow flags announcing the same grim cargo as the Wanderer. "What happens now?" Sean asked, squinting at the distant island. "Medical inspection," Michael explained, based on what the crew had told him. "The sick will be taken to the hospital on the island. The rest of us must wait until they're sure we're not carrying disease." The wait proved long. It was 3 days before quarantine officials even boarded the Wanderer. Such was the backlog of arriving ships. When they finally came, the inspection was cursory. The sheer number of arriving emigrants made thorough examination impossible. "Anyone with fever or rash, step forward," ordered the lead inspector, a harried-looking doctor who had clearly been working without adequate rest. Those obviously ill were identified and marked for transfer to the island's hospital. Many others with early symptoms or hidden illness remained undetected. The Fitzpatricks, still healthy, were cleared to continue to Quebec once the ship was permitted to proceed. But before that could happen, tragedy struck. Little Thomas, who had seemed fine during the inspection, developed a high fever overnight. By morning, the telltale rash had appeared on his arms. Hide it was Michael's first desperate thought. If Thomas was taken to the hospital, they might never see him again. Stories circulated of families separated at quarantine, never to be reunited. Catherine, however, knew the risks of typhus too well. "He needs care," she insisted, "care we cannot give him here." And so, when the medical team returned the next day to transport the identified patients, Catherine stepped forward with Thomas in her arms, his small face flushed with fever. "My son is ill," she said simply. "He needs the hospital." The doctor examined Thomas briefly. "Typhus, early stage," he confirmed. "He'll have to come with us." "I'm coming too," Catherine stated, not a request but a declaration. The doctor hesitated. Hospital space was precious, reserved for the sick, but he saw the determination in Catherine's eyes and perhaps recognized that separating mother and child would only add to the suffering he witnessed daily. "Very well," he nodded, "but only you. The rest must stay aboard until the ship is cleared." And so the Fitzpatrick family was divided. Catherine and Thomas were rowed to Grosse Ile, while Michael, Sean, Bridget and Mary remained aboard the Wanderer, watching helplessly as the small boat carried away wife and mother, son and brother. "We'll meet in Quebec," Michael called as Catherine looked back from the boat, Thomas cradled against her chest. "I promise." Whether she heard him over the water and wind, he couldn't tell, but he would keep that promise if it took every ounce of strength he had left. The hospital on Grosse Ile was a scene from nightmares. Originally designed for a few dozen patients, it now housed hundreds. Beds were crammed so close together that doctors and nurses could barely pass between them. The air was thick with the stench of sickness and inadequate sanitation. Catherine, still carrying Thomas, followed a nurse through the crowded ward. All around them lay the victims of typhus, delirious with fever, bodies covered in the characteristic rash, many clearly dying despite the medical attention. Here, the nurse indicated the only available space. "A narrow cot already occupied by another child. You'll have to share. We've nothing else." Catherine laid Thomas down beside the semi-conscious girl, who barely stirred at the new arrival. She then settled herself on the floor beside the cot, prepared to stay awake through the night if necessary to ensure Thomas received care. The medical staff worked heroically despite impossible conditions. Doctors and nurses moved from bed to bed, administering what treatments they could. Cool cloths for fever, water for dehydration, basic comfort for those beyond other help. Many of the staff had themselves contracted typhus, working until they literally collapsed beside their patients. Through the long night, Catherine bathed Thomas's burning forehead with water from a bucket shared by dozens of patients. She whispered prayers and songs from home, determined that if he could hear anything through his fever, it would be his mother's voice. By morning, the girl sharing Thomas's cot had died. Catherine watched, hollow-eyed, as orderlies removed the small body, quickly replacing it with another feverish child. The cycle of death and new arrivals continued without pause. Back aboard the Wanderer, Michael and the other children waited in anxious limbo. The ship remained anchored offshore, neither permitted to proceed to Quebec nor required to leave. Food supplies dwindled further. Typhus continued to spread despite the removal of the most obvious cases. Each day, Michael took the children to the deck, scanning the island for any sign of Catherine and Thomas. Each night he told them stories of the life they would build in America, the home they would have, the work he would find, the education they might receive. Whether he believed these stories himself anymore, he couldn't say, but they were the only comfort he could offer. A week passed, then another. The Wanderer was finally cleared to proceed to Quebec, but Michael refused to board the boat that would take them to the city. "My wife and son are on that island," he told the officer in charge of disembarkation. "I'm not leaving without them." The officer, who had seen countless families separated during this terrible exodus, showed unexpected compassion. "Wait here," he said. "I'll see what I can find out." Hours later, he returned with news. Catherine Fitzpatrick was registered at the hospital caring for her son Thomas, who was listed as condition improving. Michael's legs nearly gave way with relief. "They're alive," he whispered. "Both alive. The boy is past the worst," the officer confirmed. "They should be released within days. There's a boarding house in Quebec where you can wait for them. Many families in your situation are doing the same." And so Michael made the wrenching decision to proceed to Quebec with Sean, Bridget and Mary, trusting that Catherine and Thomas would follow once Thomas was well enough to travel. The city of Quebec, when they finally arrived, was overwhelmed with Irish immigrants. Thousands who had survived the Atlantic crossing now faced new challenges, finding shelter, work and food in a place where many viewed them with suspicion or outright hostility. Signs reading "No Irish Need Apply" appeared in shop windows. Newspapers published cartoons depicting the Irish as ape-like, disease-carrying undesirables. Protestant Quebecois feared the influx of Catholics. French-speaking residents resented the arrival of English speakers, even if they spoke with an Irish accent. Yet there were also those who showed kindness. Catholic charities provided food and temporary shelter. Some established Irish immigrants reached out to newly arrived countrymen, offering work or housing. The Grey Nuns of Montreal, in particular, became known for their care of orphaned Irish children. The boarding house where Michael and the children found space was little more than a converted warehouse, with families separated by hanging blankets for minimal privacy. But it was dry, relatively clean, and, most importantly, close to the docks where ships from Grosse Ile arrived. Each day, Michael took the children to the harbour to watch for new arrivals. Each day, they returned to the boarding house, disappointed, but still hopeful. "Tomorrow," Michael would say each night as the children fell asleep on their shared pallet. "Tomorrow they'll come." And finally, after 2 weeks of waiting, tomorrow arrived. The ship from Grosse Ile was smaller than the Wanderer, a coastal vessel used to ferry recovered patients and their families to Quebec. Catherine stood on deck, Thomas's small hand clasped firmly in hers, scanning the harbour as they approached. "Will Dar really be there?" Thomas asked, his voice still weak from his illness, but his eyes bright with anticipation. "He promised," Catherine said simply. "Your father keeps his promises." The dock came into view, crowded with people meeting the ship. Catherine's heart sank as she realised how difficult it would be to find Michael in such a throng. But then, as if by miracle, she spotted them. Michael standing tall despite his thinness, Sean and Bridget on either side of him, little Mary perched on his shoulders for a better view. Catherine waved frantically, and after a moment of searching, Michael saw her, his face transformed with joy as he pointed, showing the children. Even from a distance, Catherine could see Mary bouncing excitedly on his shoulders. The docking seemed to take forever. As soon as the gangplank was secured, passengers began disembarking. Catherine and Thomas waited their turn, both trembling with anticipation. And then, finally, they were walking down to the dock, and Michael was there, wrapping his arms around them both, the other children pressing close, all of them crying and laughing at once, a knot of family reunited against all odds. "I knew you'd come," Michael whispered against Catherine's hair. "I knew it." "Thomas is well again," she told him, her voice breaking. "He's strong, our boy." Michael knelt to embrace his youngest son, examining his face with careful eyes. Thomas was thinner, paler, but the deadly fever had broken, leaving him weak but recovering. "You've grown," Michael said, though it wasn't true. If anything, Thomas had shrunk during his illness. But it was the right thing to say. A father's acknowledgement of his son's survival, his endurance. Thomas smiled shyly, leaning against his father's shoulder. Around them, other families experienced similar reunions or waited in vain for loved ones who would never arrive. The Fitzpatricks were among the fortunate ones. They had all survived the crossing and the quarantine, a complete family unit in a time when so many had been shattered. "Where do we go now, Dar?" Sean asked as they walked away from the dock, their few possessions carried between them. "I've found us rooms," Michael explained. "Temporary but clean, and there's work available. Hard work, but it pays. We'll stay in Quebec through the summer, save what we can. Then before winter, we'll make our way to Boston." It was a practical plan, born of Michael's conversations with other immigrants who had arrived before them. Summer offered employment opportunities that would vanish when cold weather arrived. Quebec winters were harsh, perhaps even more so than those in Ireland. Boston, with its established Irish community and Catherine's brother Patrick, offered better prospects for the long term. The rooms Michael had secured were in a tenement building populated almost entirely by Irish immigrants. 2 small chambers with thin walls and shared cooking facilities. Luxury compared to the Wanderers' hold, but a far cry from the stone cottage they had left behind in Mayo. That first night reunited, they slept crowded together on pallets laid across the bare wooden floor, unwilling to be separated even by the thin wall between rooms. Catherine lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, listening to her family's breathing, cataloguing each inhale and exhale like precious gifts. They had survived. Against the horrific odds that had claimed so many, they had all survived. Whatever hardships lay ahead in this new land, they would face them together. Summer in Quebec brought steady work for Michael and Sean. The city was expanding rapidly, creating demand for labourers on construction sites. The pay was low by local standards, but seemed miraculous to people who had lived on the edge of starvation. Catherine found work too, washing laundry for wealthier families. Even Bridget contributed, minding neighbours' children while their parents worked. Only Mary and Thomas were exempt, still too young for formal employment. They saved every penny possible, mindful of the journey to Boston still ahead. Their diet improved gradually, simple but nourishing meals replacing the near starvation of recent months. The children's faces filled out, losing the hollow-eyed look of famine victims. In quiet evenings, they sometimes spoke of home, not the horror of the famine years, but earlier memories of Ireland before the Blight. Catherine taught the children songs in Irish, a language they had never fully learned, but that formed part of their heritage. Michael told stories his grandfather had told him, legends of ancient Ireland that had been passed down through generations. "Will we ever go back?" Bridget asked one night as summer waned toward autumn. Michael and Catherine exchanged glances. "Perhaps someday," Michael said carefully, "to visit, but America is our home now." "America," Thomas repeated, testing the word. At 5, his memories of Ireland were already fading, replaced by the immediate reality of Quebec and the promise of Boston ahead. As September arrived, bringing the first hints of autumn chill, the Fitzpatricks prepared for the next leg of their journey. They had saved enough for passage to Boston and a small reserve to sustain them until they found work. Catherine had written to her brother Patrick, who promised to help them get established. The night before their departure, a knock came at their door. Michael opened it to find several families from their building gathered outside. "We've come to wish you well," explained Mrs. O'Brien, who lived across the hall, "and to send you with something to remember us by." The neighbours had pooled their meagre resources to purchase gifts for the Fitzpatrick's journey. A warm woolen shawl for Catherine, a small knife for Sean, ribbons for the girl's hair, a wooden toy for Thomas. Simple presents that represented significant sacrifice from people who had little to spare. "We look after our own," Mrs. O'Brien said simply when Catherine tried to thank her, tears in her eyes. This was perhaps the most profound legacy of the famine and emigration, the creation of Irish communities abroad bound together by shared experience and the determination to survive. In Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Montreal and beyond, Irish neighbourhoods formed, providing mutual support in a world that often viewed them with suspicion. The journey to Boston proved mercifully uneventful compared to their Atlantic crossing. The coastal steamer was crowded but clean, the autumn weather favourable. Thomas, fully recovered from typhus, spent hours watching the shoreline pass, fascinated by the changing landscape. Boston Harbour welcomed them on a crisp October morning in 1847. As they disembarked, they found Patrick waiting, Catherine's brother, not seen in 7 years, now established in Boston with a job at the docks and rooms in the city's North End neighbourhood. The reunion was joyous, tinged with bittersweet memories of those left behind. Patrick had left Ireland before the worst of the famine, but he had lost parents and a younger sister to starvation before the rest of his family could join him. "You're safe now," he told the Fitzpatricks as he led them through Boston's busy streets. "It won't be easy. The Irish aren't always welcome here, but there's work if you're willing, and no one starves." Patrick had secured temporary lodgings for them, a single room, but their own, in a building filled with Irish immigrants like themselves. In the coming weeks, he helped Michael find work at the docks and Catherine secure laundry clients. Sean, at 13, found employment as a delivery boy for a local grocer. The transition wasn't seamless. They faced discrimination, shop signs declaring "No Irish need apply," suspicious glances from established Bostonians, occasional taunts about famine Irish bringing disease and taking jobs. The Catholic Church provided some refuge, but even there, Irish parishioners were sometimes made to feel unwelcome by Catholics of other backgrounds. Yet gradually they established themselves. Within a year they had moved to slightly better accommodations, 2 rooms instead of 1. The younger children attended school sporadically when work didn't require their help. Their English accents began to acquire American inflections, especially among the children. As the years passed, the Fitzpatricks became part of Boston's growing Irish community. Michael advanced from manual labour to a position as a freight handler with modest responsibilities. Sean apprenticed to a carpenter. Bridget, showing unexpected talent, found work with a dressmaker. Thomas, whose brush with death on Grosse Ile had left him with a thoughtful disposition, discovered a love of learning when finally able to attend school regularly. Mary, the most American of them all, adapted quickly to city life, making friends across ethnic boundaries. They never forgot Ireland. In their small apartment, a crude map of Mayo hung on the wall, and Catherine kept a handful of Irish soil wrapped in cloth, her last physical connection to home. They celebrated St. Patrick's Day with particular fervour and maintained Irish traditions alongside their new American identities. News from Ireland arrived sporadically, letters from those who remained, newspaper accounts, stories from new arrivals. The famine had finally ended around 1852, when the potato crop recovered and food imports increased, but its effects would shape Ireland for generations. The country's population, which had approached 8.5 million before the famine, had been reduced to about 6.5 million by its end. In the decades that followed, continued emigration would further reduce it to under 4.5 million by the early 1900s, a decline from which Ireland has never fully recovered. The Irish language, primarily spoken in the western regions hardest hit by the famine, lost generations of speakers. Cultural traditions were disrupted or lost entirely. The landscape itself was transformed as abandoned villages crumbled and field patterns changed. Perhaps most significantly, the relationship between Ireland and Great Britain was permanently altered. The perception that Britain had allowed Irish citizens to starve while continuing to export Irish food fueled nationalist sentiment. The famine became a powerful symbol in the struggle for Irish independence, which would finally be achieved in part in 1922. For the diaspora, the millions of Irish scattered across the globe by hunger and necessity, the famine remained a defining collective memory. Even those born long after, in countries far from Ireland, grew up hearing stories of the Great Hunger, the coffin ships, the struggle to survive and establish new lives. In Boston, the Fitzpatricks eventually prospered, modestly but significantly. By 1860, they had saved enough to purchase a small house in a neighborhood transitioning from Yankee to Irish ownership. The children grew up, married, had families of their own. Some to Irish spouses, others to Americans of different backgrounds. Catherine and Michael lived to see grandchildren born on American soil, to see Thomas graduate from school and secure a clerk's position in a law office, the first Fitzpatrick in memory to work with his mind rather than his hands. They saw Sean establish his own small carpentry business, Bridget become a skilled seamstress with her own clientele, Mary marry a young policeman of Irish descent. On quiet evenings, when grandchildren gathered around for stories, they would sometimes speak of Ireland, not just the famine years, but the beauty of the landscape, the richness of the culture, the resilience of its people. They kept alive the memory of a homeland many of their descendants would never see, but would always carry in their blood and in their names. In 1897, 50 years after the Fitzpatricks' arrival in America, Thomas, now a respected legal professional, travelled to Ireland with his own son, Michael, named for the grandfather who had brought them all safely across the ocean. They visited Mayo, finding it much changed but still recognisable in its essence. The cottage where the family had lived was long gone, the walls crumbled, the roof collapsed, but the hills remained, and the distant view of the sea, and something in the quality of light that Thomas remembered from earliest childhood. Standing on that spot, Thomas told his son the story of their family's journey, not just the suffering and loss, but the courage and determination that had carried them through. He spoke of the neighbours who had shared what little they had, of Captain Barton, who had honestly declared his ship's illness rather than concealing it, of the medical staff on Gross Eel who worked until they collapsed. "This is part of who you are," he told his son, as they stood on the land their ancestors had farmed for generations. Not just the hunger and the crossing, but the survival. Remember it all. And so the story passed down, generation to generation, as similar stories did in Irish families across America and the world. The Great Hunger became part of their identity, not defining them, but informing who they were and how they saw the world. In Dublin today, a haunting memorial stands on Custom House Quay, bronze figures, emaciated and desperate, walking toward the ships that might save them or become their coffins. Similar memorials exist in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and beyond, acknowledgements of a history that shaped nations on both sides of the Atlantic. The Irish who fled the famine helped build America, its cities, its railroads, its industries. Their descendants entered politics, law enforcement, education, the arts. They maintained elements of Irish culture while becoming thoroughly American, creating a hyphenated identity that honoured both heritage and new homeland. And in Ireland itself, though the population never returned to pre-famine levels, recovery eventually came. The country emerged from British rule, established its independence, and in time developed a prosperous modern economy while preserving its unique cultural heritage. The famine scars remain visible in abandoned villages, in the demographic hole left by 1 million deaths and millions more emigrations, in the collective memory of a catastrophe that nearly destroyed a people. But visible too is the resilience that allowed survival, the same resilience that carried the Fitzpatricks and countless families like them across the ocean to new beginnings. This is how history works upon us, not just in grand political movements or the actions of great leaders, but in the quiet courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. The Fitzpatricks were just one family among millions affected by the Great Hunger, their story just one thread in a vast tapestry of human experience. Yet, in their journey from a stone cottage in Mayo to a Boston neighborhood, from the edge of starvation to modest prosperity, we can see reflected the larger patterns of history, how environmental disaster combines with human policy to create catastrophe, how communities respond to crisis with both selfishness and solidarity, how trauma shapes identity across generations. And perhaps most importantly, we see how people endure, how they carry their heritage with them even as they adapt to new circumstances, how they build lives and legacies that honor both where they came from and where they've arrived. As you lie in your bed now, warm and safe, perhaps you carry some of this history in your own blood, or perhaps you simply carry it in your understanding. Either way, these stories belong to all of us, reminders of human fragility and human strength, cautionary tales and inspirations. The whispers in the soil of Ireland, the voices on the coffin ships, the determination of those who survived. They speak still if we listen. They tell us of darkness endured and light eventually found, of hunger and satisfaction, of farewell and welcome. Let these whispers accompany you now as you drift towards sleep, a gentle reminder of those who came before, who endured what seemed unendurable, who kept hope alive even in the darkest times. And with that, close your eyes and drift off to sleep.